David's son looked him in the eye and said he wasn't welcome for Christmas. No hesitation, no shame, just cold words that cut deeper than any blade. David forced a smile, but inside something shattered. Every gift, every dollar, every sacrifice suddenly felt like a joke at his expense. He walked out into the winter night with a vow burning hotter than the December cold. Justice would be restored and arrogance punished. What he did next would flip their world upside down. Before the truth is revealed, subscribe now and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. David stood in the living room, the silence around him pressing heavier than any snowfall outside, and his eyes traveled slowly across the space he had once believed was a monument to his love and sacrifice. The silk curtains that swayed lightly in the faint winter draft, the hardwood floors that gleamed under the glow of the oversized Christmas tree, the delicate crown molding running like an elegant frame around the ceiling, all of it had come from his hands, his sweat, and his bank account. He remembered the countless nights spent sitting with contractors, arguing over prices, refinancing his own modest home, just to give his son the life he had once dreamed of for himself. At first, those gestures had filled him with pride. He believed he was building a foundation not just for his son's house, but for their bond, proof that a father's devotion could be measured in every nail, every polished surface, every check signed without complaint. But as he stood there now, realizing he was no longer welcome within the very walls his money had built, that pride turned jagged, digging into him like a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The leather couch, expensive and sleek, reminded him of the day he drove 3 hours to pick it up because delivery was too costly for his son and daughter-in-law. The KitchenAid mixer gleaming in the corner carried a price tag of $2,000, a gadget his daughter-in-law swore she needed for her new baking phase that had fizzled out in weeks. The hardwood floors had required him to take out a second mortgage, a loan officer's wary eyes still haunting him as she asked if he was sure he wanted to risk so much for someone else's comfort. He had been sure then, because fathers don't hesitate when it comes to their children. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of that showroom of sacrifice, realizing every corner bore his fingerprints. But not one space made room for him anymore. His pride, once his armor, now mocked him. Every framed photograph on the wall told the same story. His face pushed further and further into the background. At first, he stood tall in those images, front and center, the proud father whose love had no limits. Then came the photos where he was off to the side, smiling faintly, while his son's new family took the spotlight. And then, finally, pictures without him at all. The house he had poured his life into had become a museum of his erasure. The air itself smelled of someone else's life, expensive candles masking the faint scent of labor and struggle he had carried with him when he handed over the keys all those years ago. He thought of Maria, his late wife, and how she had believed in him when money was tight. She had stitched curtains by hand, cooked meals on stoves that sputtered, and never complained about what they didn't have. Now he stood in a house filled with store-bought perfection, realizing the woman who had shared his sacrifices was gone, and the people enjoying the rewards wanted him gone too. David's mind turned to numbers, because numbers never lied, even when people did. $2,800 a month for 5 years. $140,000 stripped from his account, layer by layer, month by month, until he was left cutting back on groceries, wearing the same coat for winters in a row, and patching up his cracked driveway with his own 2 hands, while his son and daughter-in-law hosted wine parties for friends. He had stopped adding the totals after a while, because the math wasn't just cold. It was humiliating. Every time he opened his wallet and found it thinner, every time he said no to himself so he could say yes to them, he thought he was buying love, buying respect, buying a seat at their table. What he had really bought was silence, The silence of a man who mattered only when he paid. That silence roared now in his ears as he remembered how his son had delivered the blow. "Dad, you won't be welcome here for Christmas." The words were soft, almost apologetic, but the knife still cut clean. His son's eyes had fixed on the marble coffee table, another piece David had paid for, because he couldn't look his father in the face while banishing him. Pride had once told David that he was indispensable, that his sacrifices made him irreplaceable. But now that same pride mocked him, whispering that he had been nothing more than a wallet with inconvenient emotions. His son's house sparkled with Christmas lights, but every twinkle felt like a reminder that he had been left in the cold. He remembered years gone by when Christmas meant more than material displays. When Michael was little, David had stayed up late on Christmas Eve, assembling toys, wrapping gifts in cheap paper, and watching the boy's face light up at dawn. Those mornings had been his reward, worth every overtime shift, every bill juggled, every dream deferred. Now that same boy, grown into a man, had turned the holiday into a wall that shut him out. What once bound them together now separated them like a locked door. The irony twisted in his gut. Christmas, the season of family, had become the season he was officially cast aside. As he left the house that night, the December air cut sharp against his face, but it was nothing compared to the cold he carried inside. He walked past the Christmas tree glittering in the window, a monument to everything he had provided, and knew he would not be sitting beside it. His truck waited like an old friend, the only thing left that still felt like his. Sliding into the seat, he let the silence swallow him whole. The street stretched before him, familiar roads lined with memories of the man he used to be. The man who believed that giving everything meant you would never lose everything. That man was gone, replaced by someone harder, someone who had finally seen the truth. At a red light, he watched a young father load Christmas presents into his SUV, his children laughing and pressing their faces against the glass, their excitement fogging the windows. Once upon a time, that had been him and his son, sharing joy without conditions, without the poison of judgment or rejection. The image stabbed him with longing, but it also hardened his resolve. That father still had time. David's time was up. He had wasted too many years thinking sacrifice would buy him a permanent place in his son's life. Now he understood. It had only bought him temporary access. The price had been high, and the return was nothing but humiliation. By the time he pulled into his driveway, the cracked concrete greeted him like a reflection of his life. Broken, neglected, but still standing. His porch light flickered weakly, a repair he had put off because every spare dollar went into someone else's dream. Inside, the house felt hollow, Maria's absence louder than ever. But at least it was his. For once the walls didn't mock him with reminders of what he had given away. They reminded him instead of what he still had, dignity, if he chose to reclaim it. His phone buzzed on the counter, his daughter-in-law's name flashing like a brand. He let it ring. He didn't need to hear excuses wrapped in politeness or demands disguised as family duty. What he needed was silence, the kind that lets a man think clearly for the first time in years. He walked to his desk, pulled open a drawer, and stared at the folder he had been avoiding for months. Inside lay every bank statement, every receipt, every transfer that told the story of his foolish generosity. He spread them across the table like crime scene evidence, each sheet screaming the truth he had been too blind to see. Pride had once told him he was doing the right thing. Now those papers told him he had been used, drained, and discarded. The wound in his chest throbbed, but beneath the pain, something sharper began to take root. David sat back in his chair, the room quiet except for the ticking of a clock. His pride had been broken, but in its place, resolve began to rise. This wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something else, something his son and daughter-in-law would never see coming. The wound hurt, but it was also fuel, and he knew exactly where to aim the fire next. And just when he thought the night couldn't get darker, his phone lit up again with her name. He didn't answer, but this time he smiled, because he had already decided the next move was his, and they would never forget it. David heard the words and felt them land like stones against his chest. Maybe you could come another time. Another time, as if Christmas were an errand to be penciled in between grocery runs and oil changes, as if the one day that had always meant family, warmth, and the promise of belonging could be treated like a disposable appointment. His son's tone wasn't cruel, but that only made it worse. The casualness of it, the suggestion delivered with a shrug, carried more weight than outright rejection. It wasn't anger that hollowed him out in that moment. It was the realization that he was no longer central, no longer needed, just an old man shuffled to the side, because he didn't fit the script anymore. Christmas wasn't Christmas without him, but in their world, Christmas wasn't for him at all. The house around him mocked that reality. The glittering ornaments, the glowing lights, the expensive gifts stacked under a tree, taller than any they had ever owned when Maria was alive. All of it testified to a celebration he had financed but was forbidden to join. He remembered years when he and Maria scraped together money for presents, wrapping them at midnight while their son slept, only to wake up to his laughter as he tore through paper with joy. Those mornings had meant everything. The tired eyes worth every sacrifice. Now his son's voice suggested he could come the weekend after, as though those memories were meaningless, as though the sacred ritual of family could be rescheduled at convenience. As he walked out of the house, the December air hit him with a chill sharper than any blade, and he felt the loneliness settle in his bones. He wasn't just being excluded from a meal. He was being erased from a tradition, from the rhythm of belonging that had once defined him. His boots crunched against the driveway he had paid to pave, and each step away from the glowing house echoed the truth. He had become an inconvenience, tolerated only when it suited them, discarded when it didn't. He thought of Maria's laughter on past Christmas mornings, the way she would insist on one more photograph by the tree, the smell of tamales and spiced cider drifting through their modest home. The silence of her absence pressed harder now, for she had been the glue, and without her, the seams of family had split wide open. Driving through the quiet streets, the world outside seemed almost cruel in its normalcy. Houses glowed with Christmas lights, families moved inside around tables heavy with food, children's laughter carried faintly on the cold air. Each window he passed felt like a movie screen projecting what he had lost. At a stoplight, he caught sight of a young father loading presents into an SUV, his kids fogging the windows with eager breath. David's hands tightened around the wheels. He remembered when his son was that boy, when the promise of Christmas morning had been enough to keep him working through exhaustion. To see that memory twisted into exclusion, to realize he had been pushed aside for another family's convenience, made his throat burn. Loneliness clung to him as he pulled into his cracked driveway, the porch light flickering like a dying star. His own house felt colder than the night air, hollow without Maria, but at least it was his. Inside, the silence wrapped around him, thick and suffocating, amplifying the emptiness of his exile. He sat in his kitchen, staring at the worn counters, the outdated appliances he had promised to replace but never could, because every spare dollar had gone into someone else's dream. He thought of how many times he had said no to himself so he could say yes to them. Now here he was, eating peanut butter sandwiches for lunch while they carved roast under a tree lit with his money. The phone rang. His daughter-in-law's name flashed across the screen, the letters sharp as knives. He let it buzz, unwilling to hear her false sweetness. He could imagine her words already, phrases about understanding traditions, about making things easier, all dripping with the condescension of someone who had taken and taken until there was nothing left. He didn't answer, but the silence after the ringing was worse. It left him alone with the realization that he had traded years of his life, his savings, his dignity, for the illusion of closeness. And now that illusion had been shattered. His eyes drifted to the mantel where Maria's photograph stood. She was smiling in the picture, her eyes warm, her expression carrying the strength that had kept their family together through harder times than these. He whispered her name like a prayer, wishing she were there to steady him, to tell him what to do next. But she wasn't, and that absence carved deeper than any rejection. He realized that what his son had done wasn't just exclude him from Christmas. He had stripped him of the last link to Maria's legacy, the belief that family meant sacrifice, loyalty, and respect. He rose from his chair and walked to the desk, where a manila folder lay, heavy with the weight of 5 years of sacrifice. Bank statements, receipts, mortgage transfers, all the evidence of his devotion laid bare in ink and numbers. He opened the folder and spread the pages across the table, his eyes scanning the total he had once refused to calculate. Over $200,000. The figure glared back at him, cold and undeniable. For what? For the privilege of being told to come another time? For the honor of financing a life where he was never welcome? The bitterness gave way to something sharper. The wound of being treated as an afterthought fueled a fire he hadn't felt in years. He had been reduced to an inconvenience in their world, but in his, he was still a man, still capable of making decisions that carried weight. He reached for the phone, scrolled to the bank's number, and pressed call. His voice was steady when he spoke to the operator. The words felt foreign at first, but with each syllable, they grew stronger. Cancel the automatic transfer. The lifeline he had been extending month after month was severed in a single sentence. For the first time in years, he chose himself. When he hung up, the silence didn't suffocate him anymore. It felt different now, cleaner, sharper, like the air after a storm has passed. He looked at the fireplace, at the matchbox resting on the mantel, and without hesitation, fed the papers into the flames. 5 years of sacrifice curled into ash, the smoke rising like ghosts, finally set free. The firelight flickered across Maria's photo, and for a moment he imagined her nodding in approval, her smile carrying the quiet pride she had always reserved for him when he stood his ground. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the good bottle he had saved for a special occasion that never came. Tonight was special. Tonight he had stopped being their servant, their provider, their afterthought. Tonight he had chosen dignity over desperation. He raised the glass to the empty room, to Maria's photo, to the man he had almost forgotten he could be. The whiskey burned warm in his chest, chasing away the cold of exclusion. For the first time in years, he wasn't waiting for their approval, their call, their permission to belong. And yet, even as the warmth spread, a new thought flickered at the edge of his mind. Cutting off the money was only the beginning. His daughter-in-law's arrogance, his son's weakness, the humiliation they had orchestrated, those wounds would not heal quietly. He had been reduced to an inconvenience in their eyes. But soon, they would see how wrong they were. The question wasn't whether he would act. It was how far he was willing to go. And as the night stretched on, David realized he already knew the answer. David gripped the wheel a little tighter as the truck carried him down streets he knew by heart, every corner haunted with memories he could no longer see. the same way. The houses looked different now, not because they had changed, but because he had. He passed the bank on 5th Street, the very one where he had sat across from a loan officer years ago, signing away a second mortgage to cover his son's down payment. At the time, he told himself it was an investment in family, a gift to ensure his boy would have the start he himself had never known. He remembered the way his son had hugged him, relief in his eyes, and how David had walked out of that bank feeling like a hero. Now, staring at the same glass windows glowing under the streetlights, all he felt was bitterness. That hug had been the beginning of a bargain he hadn't realized he was making. A bargain where his love had a dollar sign and his place in the family had an expiration date. A red light stopped him at the corner of Lincoln Street, and his mind carried him back 2 years when his son had lost his job and the bills came crashing down. "Just temporary, Dad," his son had said, standing there with empty promises, while his wife clutched a purse worth more than David's monthly paycheck. He had nodded, pretending not to notice, pretending that his sacrifice wasn't feeding their indulgence. That day, he had written another check, watching the ink flow like blood onto the page, and told himself it was for family. Tonight, as the light turned green and his truck roared forward, the memory tasted rotten. It wasn't family he had been protecting. It was his own fear of losing what little closeness he still had. Block after block, the ghosts of sacrifice lined the road. The landscaping company that had redone his son's yard, paid in full by David when his daughter-in-law insisted on a more presentable front lawn. The furniture store where he had maxed out a credit card so their home would impress her parents. The contractor's office where he had sat with aching knees, signing off on a new roof for a house that wasn't his. Each building loomed in the darkness like a tombstone, marking not just money lost, but pieces of his dignity surrendered. What once felt like acts of love now looked like monuments to his own foolishness. As he drove, the numbers began to march through his head again, relentless and sharp. $2,800 every month, 60 months in a row. $168,000, not counting the down payment, not counting the extras, the little things that were never little at all. He had stopped calculating long ago because the truth had been too heavy to bear. But now it came crashing back, each figure another nail driven into the coffin of his pride. He thought of Maria then, of the savings they had built together, of the quiet conversations late at night, when they dreamed of retiring somewhere warm, maybe Arizona or New Mexico, a place where the sun would ease their old bones and they could finally breathe. Those dreams had been buried with her, but the money had been buried somewhere else, into someone else's life, someone else's comfort, while he lived with peeling paint and drafty windows. The bitterness that rose in his chest wasn't just about money. It was about trust, about love spent recklessly on people who saw it as their right instead of a gift. He remembered the early days when he had believed his generosity would buy him a permanent place at the table, when he thought every sacrifice would cement his role as the father who gave without question. But the truth had become impossible to ignore. Each sacrifice hadn't secured his place. It had weakened it, turned him into something less than a father, something closer to a resource. And now, when his usefulness had reached its limit, he had been pushed aside without hesitation. Turning onto Grand Avenue, he slowed as the truck rattled over a pothole he had once complained about. His son had laughed, brushing it off, saying they didn't have those kinds of problems in his neighborhood. David had chuckled then, proud to have given his boy the kind of life where cracked pavement was just a memory. But now that laugh echoed back at him hollow, a reminder that he had lifted his son so high that looking down on him had become effortless. He clenched his jaw, tasting regret like copper on his tongue. His own neighborhood came into view, the houses smaller, the paint fading, the yards less manicured. He had once been embarrassed by it, but tonight it looked honest. Honest in its flaws, honest in its wear, honest in the way it reflected a life built on hard work rather than handouts. His driveway, with its cracked concrete, seemed to sneer at him, asking why he had poured himself dry to polish another man's castle while his own home crumbled. He parked, the truck groaning as it settled, and for a long moment he just sat there, staring at the porch light that flickered weakly against the dark. That light had been Maria's idea. "A home should never greet you in darkness," she had said. But tonight the glow felt dim, as though even the house knew how much had been lost. Inside, the silence pressed down like a weight, thicker than the cold air outside. David tossed his keys onto the counter and glanced around at the modest walls, the worn furniture, the peeling corners of wallpaper that he had promised to replace years ago. He hadn't, because every spare dollar had gone into someone else's vision of perfection. The realization made his stomach twist. He had sacrificed not only money, but time, energy, dreams, years of his life he would never get back. For what? To be told he could come another time? To be treated like a guest in the family he had built with his bare hands? He walked to his desk, pulled open the drawer, and stared at the manila folder waiting there. It was thick with the evidence of his choices, the receipts of his devotion. He spread them across the table, the ink glaring up at him like accusations. Here was the down payment. Here was the mortgage transfer. Here was the second loan. Each page told the same story. A man who gave until he was empty, believing love could be secured with sacrifice. He ran his hand over the papers, the edges sharp against his skin, and for the first time, he let the bitterness fully take root. But beneath the bitterness, something else began to stir. It wasn't just regret, and it wasn't just anger. It was resolve, cold and deliberate. As he looked at the stack of papers, the reality hit him. He had given too much for too long, but that didn't mean he had nothing left. What remained was choice. The choice to stop bleeding himself dry. The choice to remind them what it meant to underestimate him. The choice to turn their arrogance into their undoing. He leaned back in his chair, the silence of the house no longer suffocating but sharpening. Every memory that once softened him now hardened him. Every sacrifice that once felt like love now felt like fuel. His bitterness had given him clarity, and that clarity pointed in one direction. He would not be an afterthought. He would not be erased. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid glowing in the lamplight, and raised the glass to Maria's photograph on the mantel. "No more," he whispered. The bitterness burned as he swallowed, but beneath it came a steadiness he hadn't felt in years. The man they had dismissed as an inconvenience was gone. In his place stood someone they had never seen before, someone they would never forget. And as the night deepened around him, David began to plan. The next move was his, and he intended to make it count. The phone buzzed on the counter, Claire's name glowing on the screen like a warning. David let it ring until the fourth tone, then picked up, bracing himself. Her voice came through coated in sugar, but sharp enough to cut. She talked about her parents, about their refined taste, their traditions, the atmosphere they needed for Christmas. He let her speak until the words took their true shape, until the poison slipped out in its purest form. "They expect educated conversation," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Not blue-collar stories about laying tile or fixing leaks." The insult landed like a blade twisted in old scars, dismissing decades of sweat, sacrifice, and survival. She wasn't just talking about conversation. She was dismissing his entire life, every choice that had fed her husband, every hour that had built the very house she lived in. Rage surged hot in his chest, his blood pounding in his ears. But his voice came out cold, measured, like steel drawn slow from its sheath. He asked her what she meant, forced her to repeat it, each word heavier the second time around. The silence after her sneer hung between them, ugly and raw, and for the first time in years David didn't swallow it. He didn't laugh it off, or excuse it for his son's sake. He let the fury sit inside him, shaping itself into something sharper than grief. Claire had stripped away the last illusion, exposed the contempt that had always lingered beneath her false smiles and polite thank yous. He remembered every Sunday dinner when she had devoured his cooking, praising his tamales, saying they reminded her of her grandmother. Back then she had seemed grateful. Now she called the same food unfit for her parents' table, an embarrassment to her educated circle. David's hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles white, but his tone never cracked. He reminded her, calmly, that her so-called blue-collar father-in-law had built a business from nothing, that he had employed dozens, that he had paid more in taxes than her father likely earned in his best year. He laid the truth down flat, not for her to accept, but for himself to finally say aloud. Her reply was colder, sharper, cutting deeper than she probably intended. She brought Maria into it, his late wife, the woman who had stood by him through decades of work and sacrifice. "Maria knew her place better than you do," Claire said. The line hung there like smoke in a burning room. It was the kind of statement that crossed a line David hadn't even known existed until it was shattered beneath her heel. She tried to soften it with false reason, claiming Maria had blended in, hadn't made waves, had known when to stay silent. But all he heard was the disdain, the cheap rewriting of his wife's dignity. Maria had been more than a wife. She had been the partner who stretched $1 into a meal, who stitched clothes by hand, who stood by his side when money was scarce and dreams were fragile. She had carried their family with a quiet strength that deserved reverence, not mockery. And now Claire, with her designer coats and her granite countertops bought with his money, dared to reduce Maria to a footnote, a woman who supposedly knew her place. The fury that flared in David's chest threatened to consume him, but he channeled it, shaped it into the steadiness of a man who refused to break. His voice dropped low, colder than the December wind rattling against his windows. He told Claire the conversation was over. He didn't shout, didn't curse, didn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him unravel. He ended the call with precision, his hand setting the phone down with deliberate calm. Around him, the kitchen seemed to shift. The walls, the counters, the outdated appliances, all the reminders of what he had gone without for their sake, now felt different. The air was cleaner, as if the lie he had lived under had finally been aired out. He stood there for a long moment, listening to the silence, letting it steady him. Then he moved to his desk, pulled out the folder of bank statements and receipts, and spread them across the table. 5 years of sacrifice stared back at him in black and white. Down payments, mortgage transfers, utility bills covered, luxury purchases disguised as necessities. The totals blurred before his eyes, but the rage clarified everything. He had been bled dry, called a burden, dismissed as an inconvenience, and now insulted for the very life that had kept them afloat. Yet even in the heat of that anger, dignity held firm. He would not lash out blindly. He would not lower himself to the level of petty insults. His revenge would not be a tantrum. It would be deliberate, precise, unforgettable. He sat back in his chair, the folder open before him, the weight of 5 years pressing down on his shoulders. But instead of bending under it, he straightened. The bitterness that had once felt like weakness now felt like armor. He looked at Maria's photo on the mantel, her eyes steady, her smile calm, and he whispered a promise she would have understood. No more. No more bleeding himself dry for people who spat on his sacrifice. No more silence in the face of insults. No more being erased from the table he had built. His anger had become something else now. Controlled, sharpened, ready to be used. David poured himself a glass of whiskey, the amber liquid catching the lamplight, and raised it in the empty room. "To you, Maria," he said quietly, his voice steady. "And to what comes next?" He drank deep, the fire in his chest matching the fire in his veins, and set the glass down with finality. He had been called uneducated, dismissed as blue-collar, mocked for his heritage. But in that moment, none of it mattered. What mattered was that he had finally seen them clearly, and he knew exactly what to do. The night outside pressed against the windows, cold and heavy. But inside, David felt the first warmth he had known in years. It wasn't comfort, it was power, and he knew with absolute certainty that his next move would leave scars they would never forget. The words echoed long after the call had ended, as if Claire's voice had been burned into the air itself. Maria knew her place. David sat motionless, the phone still in his hand, the line dead, but the insult alive, vibrating through his chest, with a violence no amount of whiskey could dull. Money was one thing. He had lost plenty of it, handed it over willingly, convinced himself that each check was an act of love. But Maria, that was sacred. To drag her name into their petty arrogance was a trespass beyond forgiveness. The woman who had stood beside him when there was nothing but unpaid bills and broken dreams, the woman who had held their family together with stitches and prayer, had now been reduced to a caricature by someone who had never known struggle. The rage cut deeper than any financial betrayal. It was grief reborn as fury, and it stiffened into resolve so sharp it felt like steel in his bones. His eyes drifted to the mantel where her photograph sat framed in worn silver. Maria's smile was gentle, the kind that made even the hardest days survivable, the kind that told him he was enough even when the world insisted otherwise. He remembered the mornings when she rose before the sun, packing lunches with hands cracked from scrubbing floors, humming softly so their son would wake to warmth instead of worry. He remembered the winters when she patched his coat instead of buying one for herself, the summers when she stretched a garden's worth of tomatoes into meals that lasted weeks. She had been the reason their son grew up with a full belly and a roof over his head, and now her memory was being smeared by a woman who measured worth in cocktail chatter and brand names. David closed his eyes, letting the weight of those memories press down. For a moment, the grief threatened to swallow him whole, pulling him into the ache of absence that never truly left. He had lost Maria once already. Now he felt as though he was losing her again, this time to insult and erasure. But grief wasn't the end of this story. Grief fused with anger, forming something stronger, something unbreakable. He opened his eyes, and the softness that had once guided him was gone. In its place was a steady, simmering clarity. If they wanted to turn Maria into a weapon against him, they had miscalculated. They hadn't diminished her. They had armed him. The house felt different now, as though Maria herself had shifted in the silence, urging him forward. He stood and walked through the rooms that still carried her touch. The kitchen, where she had taught him patience, the living room, where they had danced to old records when the bills were too heavy to laugh about any other way. The hallway where her laughter had once echoed like sunlight spilling through every crack. Each memory cut and healed at the same time, reminding him of everything he had loved and everything he had lost. He pressed his hand against the wall, the paint chipped, the surface cold, and whispered her name like a vow. Claire's words replayed in his head, but now they didn't sting. They sharpened. She knew her place. If Maria had known her place, it had been beside him, fighting, surviving, loving with every ounce of her being. That was her place, and she had filled it with more dignity than Claire could ever comprehend. David knew then that he could not allow her name to be left in the dirt of their arrogance. He would honor her not with tears, but with action. He sat back at the kitchen table, the bank statement still spread before him like the aftermath of a crime scene. Maria's life insurance drained, their retirement savings gone, the college fund for grandchildren he might never know, emptied. Each line of each document screamed of the trust he had placed in a family that had chosen contempt over gratitude. But tonight, the numbers weren't just reminders of loss. They were evidence, ammunition. Maria had taught him to never fight dirty, but she had also taught him to never let anyone strip away his dignity. This was no longer about money. It was about respect, hers and his, and the reckoning that was coming. The night stretched deeper, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. David poured another glass of whiskey and stared at Maria's photo, her eyes catching the light like she was waiting for him to act. He thought of how she used to say, "We can't control what people do to us, but we can control how we answer." He had let her voice soften his anger for years, let her memory quiet the urge to push back. But tonight, her words felt different. They weren't telling him to stay silent. They were telling him to rise. His phone buzzed again, Claire's name flashing across the screen, her persistence as relentless as her contempt. He let it ring out, each vibration fueling the calm fire building inside him. They thought they had broken him. They thought they had insulted him into silence, but they had done the opposite. They had given him purpose. He took another sip, savoring the burn, and set the glass down with a thud. The decision had already been made, long before Claire's voice had poisoned the air. Tonight was the end of his role as their provider. Tomorrow would be the beginning of something else. David stood, walked to the fireplace, and fed another handful of papers into the flames. They curled and blackened, the ink disappearing into ash. But this time he didn't feel loss. He felt release. The firelight glowed across Maria's picture, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. He felt accompanied, as if she were standing beside him, her presence no longer fragile but fierce, reminding him that love wasn't weakness. Love was strength, and when twisted by betrayal, it became unstoppable. He sat back down, his mind already mapping out the path ahead. There would be no shouting matches, no desperate pleas, no begging for a place at their table. There would be precision, calm and deliberate, the kind of action that left no room for doubt. He would show them what true education looked like, not in degrees or polished conversation, but in survival, in building something from nothing, in standing tall when others tried to bury you. He would remind them, and the world around them, that a man like him could not be erased. Outside, the winter wind rattled the windows, carrying with it the kind of cold that seeps into bone. But David didn't feel it anymore. Inside, the fire was enough. The resolve in his chest was enough. He looked again at Maria's photograph, her smile steady, and spoke aloud into the empty room. "They think I'm nothing," he said quietly. "But they're about to learn who I really am." The silence after those words wasn't heavy anymore. It was electric. The night wasn't just a reminder of what he had lost. It was the beginning of what he was about to take back. And as the clock ticked toward midnight, David knew with absolute certainty that Claire's insult hadn't weakened him. It had unleashed him. David sat at the table, The manila folder spread open like a confession he could no longer avoid. Pages of numbers, black ink that told the story of 5 wasted years, stared up at him. Every sheet was a receipt for his silence. Every line item a ledger of his humiliation. The down payment, the mortgage transfers, the utility bills, the furniture receipts. It was all there, evidence that he had bled himself dry to keep another family comfortable while he lived in shadows. For years he had avoided this moment, telling himself it was better not to know, better to let the numbers blur into the background. But tonight, under the dim kitchen light, he forced himself to look, and once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it. The phone felt heavy in his hand as he dialed the bank. His breath came steady, but his chest felt tight, as if the decision itself carried the weight of 1,000 chains being tested all at once. The line clicked, and a calm voice greeted him, asking for his account number, his verification. He rattled it off, his words sharp and deliberate, each number falling like a nail into the coffin of his old life. Then came the question, delivered in the same flat tone. Customer service always carried. "And you want to cancel the transfer effective immediately?" David's gaze moved around the kitchen. The peeling paint, the flickering light, the draft seeping through the window frame he had never been able to afford to replace. These walls had heard him whisper Maria's name at night, had watched him eat cheap meals so someone else could eat steak, had witnessed the slow erosion of a man's pride in exchange for scraps of belonging. For years, the answer had been yes, yes. Keep the transfer, keep the lifeline, keep feeding the illusion that sacrifice would earn him love. But tonight, the word changed. "Effective immediately," he said, his voice firmer than it had been in years. There was a pause, the faint sound of keys tapping in the background, and then the banker said it. "Done." One word, soft and clinical, but to David it felt like thunder breaking the sky. Done. The weight lifted, chains snapping loose one after another. He sat back in his chair, his chest expanding with a breath that felt like the first real air he had drawn in half a decade. For the first time in years, his money would serve his own needs. Not theirs, not the endless hunger of entitlement. His. The silence after the call wasn't empty anymore. It was clean, the kind of silence that comes after a storm clears, when the air is sharper, lighter, alive. He gathered the papers, the evidence of his martyrdom, and carried them to the fireplace. Striking a match, he touched the flame to the edge of the first page, watching the fire crawl across numbers that had once chained him. The paper curled, blackened, and dissolved into ash. The years of sacrifice turning weightless in the heat. He fed more pages in, one after another, until the folder was gone and the fire glowed warm against his face. It wasn't destruction. It was release. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, the good bottle he had saved for years waiting for a special occasion that never arrived. Tonight was the occasion. He sat in the glow of the fire, the amber liquid burning down his throat, and raised the glass toward Maria's photograph. "We're done," he whispered, not to her, but to the ghost of the man he had been, the man who thought love meant erasing himself. The burn of the drink was sharp, but it felt right, cleansing, like the fire itself had moved into his chest. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel hollow. It felt his. The cracked driveway, the peeling paint, the flickering porch light. All of it was honest. All of it was real. And for once he wasn't ashamed. He thought of the groceries he could finally buy without guilt, the repairs he could finally make without hesitation, the meals he could cook for himself without calculating how much he had left for someone else's mortgage. Liberation didn't come with applause, didn't come with recognition. It came with that single word, done, and the quiet dignity of a man choosing himself again. But beneath the relief something else stirred. Freedom was not the end. Freedom was the beginning. The cancellation of the transfer was a door opening, and on the other side was a reckoning waiting to unfold. His son and Claire would learn what it meant to underestimate him, to dismiss him as a relic, an inconvenience. They would feel the absence of his money like a crack in the foundation of their perfect house, and soon they would understand the cost of their arrogance. David leaned back in his chair, the firelight flickering across his face, and let the anticipation settle into him. This wasn't about revenge in the way they would imagine. It wasn't about screaming matches or broken plates. It was about something far colder, far sharper. It was about letting them face the life they had chosen without his sacrifices to shield them. It was about exposing the truth they had buried under luxury and lies. The phone buzzed again on the counter, Claire's name flashing like a curse. He didn't move to answer. He didn't need to. Tomorrow she would know. Tomorrow the absence of his money would scream louder than his voice ever could, and when the silence from his account stretched on, when the reality of unpaid bills and unearned comforts came crashing down, they would see the truth. He had been the backbone of their world, and they had broken themselves by breaking him. David finished his whiskey and set the glass down carefully. The fire crackled, throwing shadows across the room, and he felt Maria's presence there, not as a wound, but as a reminder. She had always believed in his strength, always known he could weather storms. Tonight he had proven her right. He had broken the cycle, stepped out of the prison he had built with his own hands, and reclaimed himself. And yet, as the fire died down and the night deepened, his thoughts sharpened into something more dangerous. Breaking the cycle was only the first step. Liberation was powerful, but justice, that was still to come. And justice, he decided, would not be quiet. It would be unforgettable. The fire crackled as the first sheet curled into blackened lace, the edges folding in on themselves like defeated soldiers. David stood with the stack of papers in his hands, the weight of them heavier than any stone he had ever carried. 5 years of sacrifice, humiliation, and silence. He slipped another page into the flames and watched as the numbers dissolved into nothing, the ink disappearing in ribbons of smoke. Each spark that leapt upward seemed to free a piece of him he hadn't realized was still chained. The fire didn't just warm his skin, it seeped into him, cleansing, burning away the years of servitude he had called love. He knelt closer, feeding another handful of receipts and mortgage transfers into the hungry blaze. The room glowed orange, shadows dancing across the walls like ghosts fleeing from the heat. For too long he had been haunted by those ghosts, regret, shame, the quiet desperation of a man who gave everything and received nothing in return. Now they melted into ash, drifting upward, leaving only the heat of release. He imagined Maria standing beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her eyes soft but firm, reminding him that dignity was never something to be given away. For years he had betrayed himself in the name of family. Tonight he betrayed no one. Tonight he reclaimed himself. He thought of the dinners he had skipped so he could cover someone else's bills, the clothes he had worn until the seams gave way, the nights he lay awake calculating how to stretch what was left after their mortgage drained him. Each page that burned was one more lie erased, one more reminder that he had confused sacrifice with slavery. The flames hissed and roared, and David felt lighter, as though the house itself was exhaling with him. The weight pressing down on his chest loosened, the suffocating sense of being trapped replaced by something sharper, cleaner. His eyes drifted to Maria's photograph on the mantel, the firelight flickering across her face, giving her smile a living warmth. He raised his glass of whiskey in her direction, the amber liquid glowing like the fire itself. "We're done with this?" he whispered. It wasn't anger in his voice. It was certainty. Certainty that the man who had allowed himself to be used, diminished, forgotten, was gone. The man who remained was someone his wife would have recognized, someone she would have respected. The fire consumed faster now, the folder growing thinner as the years disappeared in flame. He remembered how Claire had dismissed him as a relic, how his son had looked away rather than defend him, how he had swallowed insult after insult for the illusion of closeness. The flame spat and crackled as if mocking those moments, devouring them, erasing them, leaving behind only heat. He leaned back in his chair, letting the firelight wash over him, feeling his spirit cleanse itself of the rot. It was catharsis, yes, but more than that. It was rebirth. The room grew warmer, but David didn't move. He wanted to feel it, wanted to let the fire touch every part of him until there was no trace left of the man who had bowed his head for acceptance. He had mistaken guilt for duty, mistaken servitude for love. Now he saw the truth. Love didn't demand destruction. Love didn't require erasure. Love was what Maria had given him: strength, partnership, resilience. What Claire demanded, what his son had accepted, was not love. It was theft, and he was done being robbed. The last page fluttered into ash, the fire settling into steady embers, and David sat in the glow, listening to the quiet. The silence no longer mocked him. It didn't carry the emptiness of exclusion or the weight of regret. It felt clean, like standing on the other side of a storm. He sipped his whiskey, the burn of it matching the fire still alive in his chest, and let a strange smile tug at his mouth. He had lost money, yes. He had lost time, yes. But tonight he had found himself again, and that was worth more than anything he had burned. The phone buzzed on the counter, Claire's name flashing, but David didn't move. Let her call. Let her wonder. The ash in the fireplace told the story better than any words could. The lifeline she had counted on was gone. The leash she had tightened for years cut clean. And tomorrow she would feel it. Tomorrow, when the mortgage was due and the money didn't come. When the house she had flaunted as hers trembled without his silent sacrifice. She would know. David stood, set the empty glass down, and walked to the window. Outside, Christmas lights glowed in neighboring houses. Families gathered in warmth, children laughing. For once, the sight didn't sting. It didn't remind him of what he'd lost. It reminded him of what he still had: freedom, dignity, choice. He touched the glass, cold beneath his hand, and felt the sharp edge of anticipation cut through him. Freedom was only the beginning. Liberation was only the first taste. What came next? Justice. That would be the meal. The embers hissed softly behind him, whispering their approval. He turned back to Maria's picture one last time before heading upstairs, the firelight fading as he climbed. "They think they ended me," he said quietly, his voice steady, almost calm. "But they just started something they won't be able to stop." And as the night deepened, David knew with absolute clarity that the flames had not just destroyed his past. They had forged his future. David set the bottle on the counter and studied it as if it had been waiting for him all along. The good whiskey, sealed years ago, tucked away for some undefined celebration that never seemed to arrive. Every time he'd reached for it in the past, he had stopped himself, telling his own reflection that the moment wasn't special enough yet, that there would be a better time. But those better times had been swallowed by obligation, by guilt, by a life spent propping up people who sneered at the hand that fed them. Tonight was different. Tonight wasn't about them. Tonight was about him. He uncorked the bottle, poured the amber liquid into a heavy glass, and held it up in the glow of the dying fire. The light refracted through the drink, warm and golden, and for the first time in years, he felt like the moment truly belonged to him. He lifted the glass, not to anyone else, not to a family who had erased him, but to himself, to the man who had finally said no, to the man who had finally remembered his worth, to the man Maria had always believed in, the one she had seen clearly even when he had been blind to it. He whispered, "To freedom," and drank. The whiskey burned hot as it slid down his throat, but the burn was welcome, cleansing, as if it scoured away the last residue of servitude. He sat back, the glass firm in his hand, the taste lingering, rich and unapologetic. The silence of the house stretched around him, but it was no longer heavy. It wasn't the silence of being excluded, of being forgotten. It was the silence of peace, the kind of quiet a man earns when he takes his life back. He looked at Maria's picture on the mantel, her smile forever frozen in time, and for once he didn't feel only the ache of loss. He felt pride, pride that she had loved him, pride that she would have recognized this version of him, the man who could finally stand without bowing. "You'd like this," he murmured, and though the room remained still, he could almost feel her presence in the warmth of the firelight. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing with numbers or worries. There was no mortgage to cover, no bills waiting to drain him, no desperate call he had to answer. Tomorrow, for the first time in half a decade, his paycheck would be his. The thought was intoxicating, sweeter than the whiskey. He imagined fixing the porch light that had flickered for months, buying groceries without counting each dollar, maybe even booking a trip somewhere warm like Maria had always dreamed of. Small things, maybe, but they were his things, his choices, his life. He leaned back in his chair, staring into the fire, letting the glow settle into him like armor. Every insult replayed in his head, but instead of cutting, they fueled him. Claire's sneers about his work, her contempt for his heritage, the way she had spat Maria's name like it was dirt. Those memories no longer weakened him, they fortified him. His son's cowardice, his silence in the face of betrayal, no longer crushed him. It liberated him. Because if his own son couldn't see his worth, then the truth was simple. David no longer needed their approval. The triumph he felt wasn't loud. It wasn't the roar of a man demanding recognition. It was quieter, sharper, more dangerous. It was the triumph of someone who had looked into the abyss of loss and humiliation and had chosen not to fall in, but to climb out. He had broken free of their grip, and that freedom wasn't fragile. It was absolute. He knew they would call again, that they would demand explanations, that they would try to twist his choices into cruelty. Let them. Tomorrow the silence in their bank account would speak louder than any of his words. Tomorrow they would learn the cost of dismissing him. He poured a second glass, savoring it this time, letting the heat linger on his tongue. Outside, the December wind howled, rattling the windows. But inside he was calm, steady, immovable. For so long he had been their foundation, the invisible support holding up the illusion of their perfect lives. Now, without him, that illusion would crack, and he intended to watch it fall. Not with bitterness, but with the satisfaction of justice. As the fire burned lower, David felt the quiet triumph settle deeper into him, rooting itself in his bones. He wasn't just free from the transfers, from the endless demands. He was free from the illusion that he needed them at all. He had mistaken obligation for love, guilt for loyalty. But real love didn't demand his destruction. Maria had taught him that. She had loved him for who he was, not for what he could give. And tonight, he finally loved himself enough to honor that truth. He drained the last of the whiskey and set the glass down gently, the sound sharp in the quiet room. His eyes lifted once more to Maria's picture. "It's different now," he said softly. "They don't own me anymore. I don't owe them anymore." His voice didn't shake. It rang with certainty. The fire crackled, sending sparks upward, and in that moment David felt something stir inside him that hadn't lived there in years. Hope. Hope not for them, not for reconciliation or apologies that would never come, but for himself, for the life that was still his to shape. He stood, stretching, his body stiff but lighter than it had been in a long time. The man who had sat at this table hours ago was gone. In his place stood someone new, someone who had remembered what it felt like to choose himself. He turned off the lights, leaving the fire to fade on its own, and climbed the stairs slowly. The house groaned with age. The floorboards creaked. But tonight he didn't hear decay. He heard survival. Each step felt like a declaration, a man rising from the ashes of his own choices. In the bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed, pulled off his boots, and let out a long breath that came from somewhere deep inside. Tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, the world would look him in the eye and see a man who no longer bowed. But tonight was his, and his alone. Tonight was victory. Quiet, sharp, undeniable victory. And as he lay back, staring at the ceiling with the faint glow of firelight still flickering through the house, David knew this was only the beginning. The real storm had yet to come. The phone vibrated across the counter, the screen lighting the dark kitchen with Claire's name, then his son's, then again, each call stacked on top of the other, relentless, demanding, a chorus of desperation that would have once sent him scrambling to answer. But David didn't move. He sat in his chair, the glass still warm in his hand, watching the glow of the fire reflect off the edges of the whiskey. Every buzz was a reminder that the silence in their world had begun. For years he had filled it, kept the gears of their lives turning smoothly with his sacrifice. Now the gears had jammed, and they were finally hearing the grind. Instead of guilt, he felt a calm so steady it startled him. Anticipation. The quiet space before justice strikes, when the enemy hasn't realized yet that the battle is already lost. He leaned back, letting the chair creak, and stared into the fire. He could picture them perfectly, pacing in that house, the walls he had paid for closing in on them as the truth began to seep through. Mortgage due, bills mounting, no safety net waiting to catch them. They had mistaken his silence for weakness, mistaking his generosity for obligation. Now they would feel the cost of underestimating him, and he didn't need to lift a finger to make it happen. His refusal had already done the work. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't about shouting or fist-pounding on tables. It was about letting the entitled fall into the pit they dug themselves, about watching arrogance collapse under its own weight. His mind drifted back to Maria, her voice echoing in memory. We can't control what people do to us, but we can control how we answer. For years he had chosen patience, swallowing the bile, believing forgiveness would buy him respect. Tonight he had chosen differently. Tonight his answer was not silence. It was the absence of himself from their world, and that absence was louder than anything he could have said. He imagined Maria's eyes on him now, not with sadness, but with quiet pride, because she had always known he was stronger than he believed. She had seen it in the way he built his life with his hands, in the way he fought through lean years, in the way he protected what little they had. And now that strength, buried under years of sacrifice, had returned sharper than ever. The phone buzzed again, vibrating against the wood, but he only smiled. Each unanswered call built the tension higher. Each ignored plea turned the knife a little deeper. He wasn't just withholding money. He was withholding control, the invisible leash they had grown accustomed to yanking. Without it, they would have to face themselves. And David, for the first time in decades, felt no urge to save them from the fall. The anticipation inside him wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about restoring the order they had shattered when they treated him as nothing. Justice wasn't vengeance. Justice was truth. He thought about the years he had spent as their foundation, invisible and taken for granted. He had been the quiet laborer behind their comfort, the man who kept the lights on while they mocked the calluses on his hands. That man was gone. The one sitting in this chair now was something different, someone who had remembered his worth, someone who no longer begged for a seat at the table. They had stripped him of pride, of dignity, of love, but in the process, they had sharpened him into something they could no longer control, and soon they would learn that the man they dismissed as blue-collar could dismantle their world with nothing more than a single word. No, the fire crackled, sending sparks upward, and he let the sound wash over him. It was the sound of release, of endings and beginnings. He poured himself another glass, not out of habit, but out of celebration, each sip a reminder that the power was his now. For too long, he had lived as though his survival depended on their acceptance. Now it was their survival that depended on him, and he had chosen to let them face the reality without his shield. The thought didn't make him bitter. It made him steady. This wasn't spite. This was balance returning. He could almost hear the arguments unraveling in that house. Claire raising her voice, his son fumbling excuses, both of them realizing that the man they had erased from Christmas dinner was the same man holding the strings of their lives. Panic would set in. Anger would follow. But beneath it all would be the cold, creeping fear of dependence exposed. They had treated him as disposable, but now they would learn the truth. He was the cornerstone, and without him, everything cracked. The phone went still at last, the silence humming through the house. David set his glass down, stood, and walked to the window. Outside, the night was sharp and quiet, the kind of quiet that feels alive, humming with the promise of what's to come. He touched the glass, the cold seeping into his fingers, and let a slow breath escape. For the first time in years, he wasn't bracing himself for the next demand. He was bracing himself for the satisfaction of watching justice take its course. He turned back to the fire, its glow steady now, the embers burning with a patient intensity. That was what he felt in his own chest, patience edged with certainty. They would call again. They would beg, curse, manipulate. Let them. The outcome had already been decided. His life was his again, and theirs, for the first time, would be theirs alone to carry. David sat back down, the shadows shifting around him, and allowed the anticipation to settle deeper. It was a dangerous calm, the kind a man only feels when he knows the storm is no longer his to fear. They had underestimated him. Soon they would see. The silence between the buzzing phone calls wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of justice gathering strength, and David, glass in hand, waited for it with the certainty of a man who finally understood his power. Life has a way of testing where we draw the line between sacrifice and self-respect. David's story reminds us that love should never mean erasing ourselves. For years, he believed that giving endlessly to his family would guarantee loyalty and gratitude. But what he received in return was dismissal and insult. The turning point came not in anger, but in reclaiming his dignity, choosing to stop feeding entitlement and start honoring his own worth. For many older Americans, this lesson resonates deeply. We spend decades working, saving, and providing. But we must remember that our value isn't measured by the checks we write or the sacrifices we quietly endure. Our lives, our choices, and our peace matter just as much as anyone else's. True love and respect can't be bought. They are earned through loyalty and mutual care. And when others fail to give us that, it's not weakness to step back, it's strength. David's quiet triumph reminds us that sometimes the most powerful word we can say is no. If this story spoke to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't miss the next video. We've got more stories that will keep you thinking long after they end.